I want to remind you that Raymond Finch comes to us. He's a graduate of KU's own Russian East European Eurasian Studies, and was my predecessor here at KU, but he is senior analyst at the Foreign Military Studies Office over at Fort Leavenworth. He works on a variety of programs there, but one of the things that he's also involved with is the FMSO internship program, working with our students who are doing open source research as an internship program at FMSO there. So I'm going to turn.
Okay, great. Well, again, thank you for allowing me to say a few words about one of my favorite Russian radio stations. Over the past 6 years, while working as Eurasian analyst at the Foreign Military Studies Office, I've spent an average of, I'd say a couple hours a day monitoring various Russian media. Our office produces open source, unclassified studies from the foreign perspective on understudied from countries from around the world. My mandate is Eurasia, primarily Russia and Ukraine. Monitoring the Russian media has provided me with a valuable context and allowed for a broader understanding when examining individual security-related topics. Unfortunately, since much of the major Russian media today reflects the current Kremlin perspective, it has been a challenge to find Russian sources which offer alternative views. This is where Echo Moscow comes in. Listening to Echo on a daily basis has helped me develop a more balanced analysis of the situation in Russia. My talk this afternoon will examine how this quasi-opposition media outlet has survived within Russia's increasingly repressive media environment. Here's a brief outline. A couple of caveats before we begin. First, I'm not a Russian media expert, and other than being a frequent consumer, have no special training on this topic. Second, this is a much bigger topic than 30 minutes will allow, and I'm afraid I'll have to rely upon some broad generalizations. Hopefully we'll be able to discuss some of the details during the QA. You can see from the logo on the slide that Echo celebrated its 25th anniversary this past year. According to its website, Echo is a radio station which broadcasts news, analysis of current affairs, cultural, historical, and interactive programs based on the principles of independent journalism which does not take sides. Those last two phrases deserve to be repeated, especially for the Russian audience, who tend to be more skeptical regarding the notion of objective or independent journalism. Is everyone here familiar with Echo's website? Well, if you're not, let's just take a look at it here a second. Take 1 minute. Let's just take a minute. A couple of features I have found to be very helpful are their recorded interviews. You can go to their interview section, and in it, they provide not only you can download and listen to, but for many of the interviews, you can actually, they provide a written transcript. So here you can see, well, let's see, Особое мнение Orhan Jamal. I can either download it, I can watch it, and so Echo is actually more than a radio station. It's kind of a quasi-TV station. You can read what they have, or you can just listen to it. So that's what they have, a very good, nice, easy-to-use format. Another thing are the опроsi. What are the Russians thinking, or the listeners of Moscow? And so you can come here to their poll section where they have a lot of interactive daily programs, and you can ask. For instance, Ramzan Kadyrov said today that he was ready to leave the post of the leader of Chechnya. What do you think? Do you think he's leaving because he wants to leave, because he wants to stay, or do you have difficulty? Well, let's just say I'm saying it because he wants to stay, because he knows that Mr. Putin knows that if he leaves, guess what? Chechnya is going to go south quickly. And so then we can see how the listeners at Echo, and you can see many of them also agreed that he said it primarily because he'd stay, and then by telephone you can do it. So there's a whole series of questions they ask on a daily basis. And again, Echo's audience is a bit unique, but still I think it provides a nice snapshot of what the Russian people are thinking on various issues. The blog site is also very good. They have a list of blogs from all over, not just liberal. They have some very conservative blog writers, so that you get the wide spectrum. So you can see in their blog site, they include everybody from, Yevgeny Roizman, who's the mayor of Yekaterinburg, to, you can see down here, who did I see today, Michael Bohm, who's this independent American journalist. And you can read their blog post, so it's a handy site. Let's see, what other point did I want to say? There's a lot of interactive features. When you listen, you can either write to the person and say, hey, look at what you talk about this, or you can vote. They have a thing called a cardiogram where you can follow how listeners react to a speaker's comments. So it's much more than just a radio station. So if you take nothing else from today's talk, I hope that you would spend an hour or two navigating the ECHO website. It is, for an analyst like myself, it's a gold mine of information. Let's see. Here's my main point or thesis. Like the rest of Russia, ECHO has changed dramatically over the past 2.5 decades, but its essential mission has remained unchanged, providing uncensored and timely information as a hedge against a totalitarian form of government. In the upper picture, you can see Alexei Venediktov. That's ECHO's iconic editor-in-chief. Believe it or not, Venediktov has been leading ECHO longer than Putin has been leading Russia. He started in '98 as the editor-in-chief there. The question I wanted to consider centers upon how has a decidedly, though not completely liberal radio station been allowed to continue broadcasting within an ever more conservative, some might say repressive, media environment. My answer, ECHO has survived via a combination of courage, compromise, and professionalism, alongside considerable public indifference, massive media competition, and perhaps a sense within some of the Russian elite that the country may be headed in the wrong direction vis-a-vis free speech. My initial hypothesis posited that ECHO would serve as the proverbial canary in Russia's dangerous media mine. ECHO's going silent or undergoing a drastic change of management would indicate that the Kremlin leadership had taken a path toward an even more repressive form of governance. It would demonstrate that the freedoms won after the collapse of communism, particularly those dealing with the free media, had once again become jeopardized. What I discovered instead was a bit more complex and nuanced, and I hope to elaborate these various shades over the next 20 minutes. President Putin would likely laugh at the accusation that today's Russia belongs in the totalitarian camp. I'm not so sure how Venediktov would respond. This past June, he gave an interview where he said, "The Russian system today is absolutely 100% authoritarian, and it is drifting toward totalitarianism." He went on to say, "The major trend, as I see it, is the elimination of competition in all areas. Putin wants to monopolize all things, politics, ideology, culture, you name it." This may not be a laughing matter, as ECHO may either be eliminated or more likely co-opted to such a degree that it becomes part of what is known as the systemic or Kremlin-controlled opposition. If this were to occur, Russia would likely become a more troublesome country. This image is an exaggeration, but it sort of represents the media environment in which ECHO must operate within today. One of the most significant achievements of Putin's reign over the past 16 years has been the consolidation of major Russian media under Kremlin control. Regarding specific policies, say Ukraine, Syria, or the refugee crisis in Europe, the major Russian media outlets all sing off the same page of music. This is especially true for the 3 major Russian TV stations, which remain the chief conduit of information and entertainment for the majority of Russians. This control over the media has allowed the Kremlin to portray its perspective and ideology in a consistent, persistent, coordinated, and largely one-sided manner. This pro-Kremlin perspective is broadcast from morning talk shows to call-in radio to magazines and newspapers, evening TV news, and documentary films, which are then cut and pasted across much of the internet. It results in a 24/7, highly professional media saturation, which has proven to be very effective. Unless the average media consumer, the average Russian media consumer, makes the effort, he or she has hardly ever been exposed to a perspective which deviates significantly from the approved Kremlin viewpoint. You can see from this side where Russians typically get their news. TV far outweighs radio. One possible advantage for Echo and other radio stations stems from the impossible traffic situation around major Russian cities, where drivers are often stuck in traffic for hours, and to pass the time, many listen to the radio. First, a little bit about Echo's history. Echo was created during the heady days of the late Glasnost period, when many Russians began to see the correlation of free speech and a more effective system of government. Echo first broadcast in August 90, exactly 1 year before the failed coup attempt, which led to the dissolution of the USSR. Earlier that year, 1990, the new law on the press came into force in the USSR, establishing freedom of speech, banning censorship, and allowing independent media outlets to be formed. Echo was established by a group of Moscow State University journalists. As Venediktov later recounted, some of his comrades were tired of lying, so they decided to start their own radio station. Echo played an important role during the aborted coup attempt of August 91, when state radio stations went silent or began to play classical music. The authorities tried to shut down Echo, but it managed to remain on air, and Venediktov interviewed some of the key officials in the Russian White House where Yeltsin was holding out. Echo is therefore associated with the liberals who came to power in the USSR after it fell apart in December 91. Echo and Venediktov in particular returned to the Russian White House in October 93, when Yeltsin ordered the shelling of the building, which had been occupied by the so-called Red-Brown coalition of communists and nationalists. During this uprising, Yeltsin's rebellious vice president, Alexander Rutskoy, borrowed Venediktov's phone and used it to call on the Russian Air Force to bomb the Kremlin. Echo broadcast Rutskoy's tirade. The rebellion was eventually suppressed and Rutskoy imprisoned. 2 months later, a group of reporters, including Venediktov, was invited to a meeting with Yeltsin. Yeltsin strode into the room and angrily addressed Venediktov. "Echo, you should be ashamed of yourselves," he said. "Why did you broadcast? Comrades, the plane should be launched. You have to go bomb the Kremlin." Venediktov said that he thought he'd be lucky to leave the room alive. He replied to Yeltsin, "Boris Nikolaevich, this is my job. Echo sent me there. I'm not to blame. They just said do it, and I did it." Yeltsin looked at Venediktov a while and then said, "Oh well, you have a job. You're a good worker, so go work." During the 90s, Echo continued to grow and become more influential. In 94, it began 24/7 operations. In 98, it launched its first internet site. It also began to be broadcast in a number of other Russian cities. Its expansion and growing influence are important points, for the narrative surrounding what occurred during the 90s has changed dramatically over the past decade. Initially, many looked at the collapse of communism, the Warsaw Pact, and the USSR as signs that Russia was returning to a, quote, normal path of economic and political development. The freedom of speech and variety of opinions found on Echo were symbolic of these changes. These sentiments, however, were short-lived, primarily due to the country's painful economic transition. The Russians have a popular saying which goes, "He who pays for the music orders the song." And it's important that we briefly look at who or what has held a controlling stake in Echo's finances. Initially, the station was one of the not-so-rare co-op ventures which sprang up as the USSR was falling apart. Garry Kasparov was a large share owner of early Echo. By 96, however, the station was purchased by the expanding media holding known as Media Most, which was primarily owned by the Russian oligarch Vladimir Guzinsky. Not long after Putin came to power, the standard narrative regarding the 90s began to change, where the freedoms gained by the collapse of communism were replaced by memories of economic injustice and uber-liberal freedoms. The 90s were soon labeled the wild decade, and since Echo gained much of its popularity during this period, it is considered partially guilty by association. For many Russians, Echo serves as a reminder of the liberal chaos they experienced during that period. As you are well aware, one of Putin's first initiatives as president was to consolidate all the major Russian media under quasi-Kremlin control. To make a long story short, soon Guzinsky was living abroad in exile, and a large part of his media holding, Media Most, had been acquired by Gazprom Media, to include Echo. Since 2001, Echo has been partially owned by Gazprom, the gigantic energy conglomerate that is one of the bases of the Kremlin's economic and political power. Venediktov calls the Kremlin, quote, our main shareholder. Today, the radio station is organized in the form of a closed joint stock company, where 66% of the shares belong to Gazprom Media, and 34% are divided among the radio journalists. And my understanding is Venediktov controls about 15% of that 34%. Echo today. Let's look at it where it is today. The picture shows where their studios are located. You might recognize the Novi Arbat section of downtown Moscow. The picture on the right shows, both the pictures there show their new radio TV studios. There, Venediktov is interviewing John Byerly, former U.S. ambassador to Russia. And you can't see him, but that's Mikhail Gorbachev in the one on your left. Let me see, what else did I want to say? Okay. Many have claimed that Echo is merely a Moscow phenomenon and that it doesn't really represent the interest of the wider population. This slide shows where Echo is rebroadcast throughout Russia. You can see it's a number of big cities throughout Russia. The purple are the ones that the license belongs to Echo Moscow. According to various polls, Echo enjoys a relatively high influence rating, particularly with regard to being cited by other Russian news sources, and potentially it has a huge audience, claiming to reach 3 million Russians on a daily basis. You can even say Chicago. If you want to listen, you can go to dial into FM station in Chicago, pick up Echo Moscow. Here's a slide from Echo's marketing package that sums up its major selling points. It claims to be the most popular radio station among Muscovites over age 35. In my research, however, I found that some of the other big radio stations in Moscow made similar claims. Given that Echo has remained rather objective in its reporting and somewhat critical of many Kremlin policies, how has it been able to survive? First and foremost, because of its reputation as a professional news organization. It truly contains some of the best programming available on Russian radio today. Here are two charts from recent surveys detailing the most popular radio stations in Moscow. And again, I listened to all of these, and I can tell you just from the programming perspective, Echo Moskvy is far superior. The other ones, they don't have nearly the depth of opinions or just the freedom of speech that I think Echo enjoys. Here's another one from 2013. Again, professionalism and quality programming. You can see. See where I am. Here we go. Another reason it has survived have been the important connections Echo has made among many global leaders and politicians. As former U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice once said, in Soviet times, a visit to Moscow had 3 mandatory stops: the Kremlin, the Bolshoi Theater, and Lenin's mausoleum. She went on to say that once the Soviets fell, the first 2 remained requirements, but the third item on the itinerary had changed. Instead of viewing Lenin's mummy, Western delegations have to stop by Echo Moscow's offices. You can see there, if you can't see real carefully, but this picture right here, that's Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. He was interviewed in '98 when he was working in the Kremlin administration. So he's even on there. That wall is much bigger than that. It's filled now with photos. You can see perhaps our next commander-in-chief up there, Госпожа Clinton. Another strategy used by Echo is to allow a platform for a wide range of political viewpoints, from pro-Westerners to those who ardently support the Kremlin. Here you can see some of the liberals on the left and the more conservative commentators on the right. And what I've noticed over the past year is that fewer and fewer of those who are most vocal in their support of the Kremlin are willing to appear on Echo. And I suspect that they fear of being somehow supportive of the station. And there you can see, everybody from Navalny to, but there's Boris Nemtsov prior to, again, his murder. We're celebrating it this week. He was assassinated a year ago. 2 hours before he was killed on the streets of Moscow, he gave an interview in Echo Moskvy. And on the right, you can see there's Alexander Prokhanov at the top and Vladimir Zhirinovsky at the bottom. But again, this is just a very small smattering of the people that Echo has literally on a daily or weekly basis. A wide spectrum of voices are heard. Over the past couple of years, Echo has developed still another strategy whereby some of their programming allows various pro-Kremlin officials, I won't say pro-Kremlin, I'll just say Kremlin officials, a prominent voice. Here you see 3 programs. Arsenal, which is where the military-industrial complex, they have somebody out of their military-industrial complex comes and talks about new weapon systems, what's being developed. They've got one, Voyenny Soviet, where they get somebody out of their military, usually out of the military, come and talk about developments in the military. And then they've got the briefing with Dmitry Peskov, that's Putin's press spokesperson. And they have programs every week on Echo, which I think is a way to, hey, look, we're providing a wide range of opinions here. But I suspect that the most important reason why Echo has survived is due to the support it received from the Kremlin leadership, specifically from Vladimir Putin. This is not to suggest that the Putin administration is a strong advocate of liberal values, but rather that permitting Echo to continue to broadcast serves its larger interest. First, allowing Echo to survive is proof of the Kremlin's democratic credentials and belief in free speech. On a theoretical level, those close to Putin understand the dangers of stifling dissenting voices. Tolerating Echo to voice these protests allows a release valve for social discontent. Second, rumor has it that some within the Kremlin administration use Echo as a more accurate barometer of public opinion, at least on certain issues. And finally, by allowing Echo to exist, the Kremlin leadership has created an easy domestic target to channel internal anger and dissent. The Kremlin isn't at fault. Rather, it's the fault of the liberals at Echo. We all know the folly of trying to make any accurate predictions when it comes to Russia, but here are a couple of thoughts. From my perspective, the Kremlin leadership is moving in a problematic direction. Corruption remains endemic. Its political model is based more on fear, nursing resentments, and simmering nationalism than with actually providing the Russian people with a say in running their country. As the economy continues to sputter and as concerns over the presidential election in 2018 escalate, I suspect that there will be an ever greater attempt to control the flow of info within the country. In this regard, I think there are 3 possible alternatives as to the future of Echo: elimination, subversion, or the shaky status quo. As Venediktov has said many times, the Kremlin has the power to turn Echo off the air in a moment's notice. They could always find some legal pretext as to how Echo was not in compliance with the ever more repressive media legislation. As ad revenues have decreased over the past year, they could make it even more difficult for the station to meet its operating expenses. More darkly, and perhaps if the Kremlin wanted to send a stronger message to any opposition, they could release their Chechen attack dogs against Echo's current leadership. Here you see an image from a pro-Kadyrov rally held in Grozny last month. It is well known that the Chechen leader harbors ill feelings towards Echo. And that sign there, Alexei Navalny, a couple years ago, he coined a phrase, "Khvatit kormit Kavkaz," stop feeding the Caucasus, stop sending all this money into Chechnya regions. You can see what that says, "Khvatit kormit Venediktov." And that was, stop feeding Venediktov. Here are a couple of other slides which reflect some of the vitriol and hatred toward Echo. And it is a target of hatred among many in Russia. Anti-Semitism plays a role. Some Russian uber-patriot could take it upon himself to shut the station down. Knocking off Venediktov and a handful of other Echo journalists would probably be enough to silence the radio forever. I hope that it doesn't come to this. Another option would be to subvert the station from within. I suspect that Gazprom Media could figure out a way to make Venediktov an offer which he couldn't refuse. By patiently replacing key personnel and buying or pressuring others, over time, ECHO could be transformed into part of what is known as the loyal opposition, which, like sovereign democracy, has nothing to do with being a genuine opposition within an actual democratic system. There are some liberals today in Russia who argue that ECHO has already started down this path. Over the past year, there have been a couple of key personnel losses at ECHO, presumably over the direction the station is heading. You can see there Marina Koroleva and Sergei Korzun both left. They were both longtime employees. In fact, Sergei Korzun was one of the founding people. They left this past year over ECHO's editorial policies. There was also a sort of a mini scandal involving one of ECHO's journalists. You can see here there, Lesya Ryabtseva, who apparently went out of her way to discredit the station before quitting this past fall. And there's, again, in the social media sphere, a lot of people said that she must have been a Kremlin plant there to discredit the station. There was all sorts of rumors that she and Venediktov were having closer relations. The final option would be the most optimistic, where ECHO soldiers on and remains committed to its initial charter of, quote, independent journalism which does not take sides. Given the current direction of the country, with swelling economic problems, increasing nationalism, and a growing sense of paranoia, combined with other challenges that the Kremlin will likely face over the next year or two, this may prove to be the most unlikely version. I hope that I'm proven wrong and that the Kremlin leadership continues to value ECHO Moscow for its ability to, quote, provide uncensored and timely information as a hedge against a totalitarian form of government. I look forward to your questions.